I have to say it. This game really makes me feel like Spider-Man 2.
Marvel's Spider-Man 2, not to be confused with all the other Spider-Man 2 games, is Insomniac's continuation of both Marvel's Spider-Man and the Miles Morales game. While I've never gotten into the comics, I've always enjoyed most of the Spider-Man movies, and enjoyed watching the shows and playing some of the games as a kid. The Spider-Man 2 movie game adaptation, in particular, was definitely a childhood favorite of mine, and I played through it multiple times. After feeling kind of dissatisfied with the Spider-Man 3 game adaptation though, I kinda stopped getting any of the Spider-Man games after that for a long time. But this new original series by Insomniac has definitely got me back into them, and this new sequel definitely continues the fun. The game definitely sticks closely to the formula of the previous games, and doesn't do too much to change the status quo. Swinging around the open world of New York City is still as fun as before, and provides you with plenty of crimes and side activities to partake in as the game progresses. The combat is still fast and chaotic, and takes some time to get the hang of again, but is fun once you get it down. The MJ stealth missions return too here and there, although she isn't as defenseless this time around. The game still has a heavy emphasis on its story, and has a cinematic feel to it like the previous games too. It took me about 23 hours and 54 minutes to complete the story with lots of side quests done, and then about 5 hours in addition to complete all of the side quests to get the Platinum Trophy. On a surface level, this game definitely feels pretty much the same, but it does add some new additions to differentiate itself too. The big draw of this sequel is that it allows you to play as both the Spider-Man, Peter, and Miles. They share the same basic controls for everything from fighting to swinging around, making the switch between them very seamless and easy. Both characters have a large variety of unique costumes for you to unlock, which I like how this game allows you to pick different color palettes for some of the costumes, although I wish they all had this option, as many of the movie-themed ones only have one. While they control the same, the animations of how the two Spider-Men move and fight are different, but that's definitely a minute detail I feel has little to no effect on the gameplay. Their main difference from each other are their special abilities. Miles' electrical venom abilities and invisibility returns from his game. Since Peter didn't have a unique ability to carry over from his game, they introduced the spider arms for him to give him something unique from Miles. I felt these were a nice homage to his experience with Doc Ock from the first game too. Both characters also get new special abilities as the game progresses. Miles unlocks, Evolved Venom, which from what I can tell are essentially his electrical powers, but now blue. These definitely felt more useful to me than his original Venom powers, so it definitely felt like a nice upgrade. The big new ability is definitely the symbiote powers for Peter though. These are definitely really fun to use, and you can really feel the power Peter is experiencing from them. The unusual amount of aggression Peter exhibits with the symbiote abilities definitely makes you feel uneasy using them too, despite its utility to Peter, and makes you wonder, should I be using these? All of these abilities are definitely fun to use though, and it definitely makes each of the Spider-Men feel different from each other in combat and gives them their own strengths. There are a few more new gameplay additions the game adds. They've added more parts of the city you couldn't previously visit in the prior games across the river. Since swinging across the river isn't the most viable option, to help overcome this and give the Spider-Man a new way to traverse the air, they implemented the web wings. They take a little to get used to controlling, but it definitely feels natural after some time. Although, I have to say, swinging normally is much more fun overall. That said, these web wings definitely have utility when you want to maintain your height or travel distances where tall buildings aren't as plentiful, so I think it's a good addition to add some variety and speed to traveling. For combat, they've also added the ability to parry attacks in, and I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of this addition. I do get why they added it, as it seems to be inspired by the current God of War games, and adds some variety to responding to enemy attacks besides just jumping or dodging. But I feel it isn't a very characteristic thing for Spider-Man to do frequently, so it was something I used sparingly unless I had to, like in a lot of boss fights. Speaking of the boss fights, I had mixed opinions on them too. They were definitely fun for the most part, but I'm not sure if any of them were as good as some of the boss fights from the first game. One thing I like about these fights is they definitely feel grand and cinematic, which melds well with the story-heavy nature of the game. There's definitely a lot of them in the game too, and they each feel different from each other. I didn't notice right away, but I like how they show how many phases of the fight are left too, which I don't think I've ever seen a game do before. That all said, I feel the boss fights weren't as creative or as inventive as some of the first games. Since it's been years since I played it, I can't remember them all, but I remember the Electro and Vulture fight was super fun, and it forced you to swing around and fight in the air. And there was also the Rhino and Scorpion fight, where you had to use the stealth mechanics. These fights utilized all the mechanics you had at your disposal throughout the game, and I felt that wasn't as much of a focus in the sequel. Sure, some of the boss fights in this one included swinging, and there's ways you can interact with the environments to influence the fight, But for the most part, I felt these boss fights were largely focused on parrying and dodging the crate openings for you to attack. This is probably where God of War's influence has come in perhaps a bit too much again, since even though those ideas work well for that game, I feel the heavy emphasis on blocking attacks doesn't feel as good in a Spider-Man game. I'm going to delve into my thoughts about the story a bit now. I won't say major spoilers, but if you'd rather not hear anything, I advise you to skip ahead to this point. Alrighty, here we go. Due to the cinematic nature of the game, the story is definitely an important piece of the game that was a major focus. The game definitely starts off with a bang, with a huge and intense boss fight, and per usual for Spider-Man, they both are struggling to balance their personal lives with the demands of being a superhero, as a new threat, Kraven the Hunter, comes to the city. None of the Spider-Man media I've experienced has had this villain before, so it was cool experiencing him for the first time, and the game definitely showed how intimidating he is. In addition to Kraven, the Venom symbiote is introduced too, which is a plotline I've always enjoyed in other Spider-Man stories. I feel they did this plotline a little differently than usual, so there's definitely still a lot of mystery and tension involved, even if you're familiar with the storyline. The plot also tries to do its best to treat Peter and Miles equally as the main protagonist. The main story switches between the two regularly, and definitely tries to give them equal amount of screen time. It certainly felt they had an equal amount of individual side quests too. Some of the biggest parts will even have you switching between the characters during the middle of the level. Both characters also face some parallel struggles with the darkness within themselves, and struggling not to lose themselves to it. They both become frustrated too with each other as the troubles in the city continue to escalate. It definitely isn't always the easiest to make two characters both be in the spotlight. So while I feel they did try their best, I did feel the game was slightly more focused on Peter overall. He had a bit more of a connection with a lot of the major characters and the symbiote plotline, which made him feel more of the main character here. That said, I feel the game did a pretty good job of balancing them for the most part. And without saying too much, I could see them focusing on Miles more in a sequel or DLC if they do that. A theme I noticed the game had and enjoyed was that both characters had to deal with the question, can villains be redeemed? Early on in the game, we learned some villains like the Lizard and Mysterio have been rehabilitated to normal life and are trying to live their lives while separating themselves the best they can from their problematic pasts. However, with the arrival of Kraven, many of the villains, both in the wild and in prison, must enter the fold again as they're being hunted down. The Spider-Man have to track them all down to protect them from both Kraven and themselves. Granted, the question of if it's worth saving these villains constantly comes up, and since Miles and Peter are both struggling with their anger, it makes you wonder if they might possibly cross the line and break their own rule of no killing. Overall, I really enjoyed the story of the game, and it definitely had me engrossed. I think at the moment, I prefer the story of the first game slightly more, but this was definitely a good sequel to it. While there certainly were moments in the plot that caught me by surprise, some of it was a bit predictable too. And I feel this Spider-Man game in particular would have benefited if players could influence the plot in some way. Like, maybe they could have done something like the Infamous games, where the new powers Peter and Miles unlocked from the symbiote and evolved Venom have some sort of karma system that would have an impact on the story if you used them too much. But I understand it's not the style of game they were going for, and they wanted to tell a singular story without having to play around with alternative endings. I just wish it felt there was more consequence for using these more aggressive abilities outside of personal preference. Regardless of that though, the story definitely had me hooked, to the point where in the later parts of the story, I pretty much put most side quests on hold due to the urgency of the main plot. And like the previous ones in the series, there's a lot of side quests spread out throughout the city for you to play around with, and I ended up doing all of them and got the Platinum Trophy. There's definitely a lot of variety of side quests to choose from that emphasize the different aspects of playing as Spider-Man. There's the usual crimes that pop up randomly, which I feel are fun in the early game, but after a while you start to lose the incentive to do them. As in this one, the reward usually isn't worth it as you get further into the game. The other predetermined side quests are still the same old fun though, and more rewarding. Some side quests are combat focused, like the Hunter hideouts and the Mysteriums. The picture-taking side quest emphasizes exploring the city, and the drone chases play around with a new web wing mechanic. And while most of these side quests have some sort of plotline, there's even more story-focused quests with the Flame Gang and the Harlem Music Museum. There's also these new Spider App quests that tell a concise, smaller-scale story involving the community. These Spidey App quests definitely are a little experimental, and have Spidey deal with more down-to-earth moments that might tug at your heartstrings a little. Doing all of these quests isn't too difficult, or a lengthy process either, so, like its predecessor, it's definitely a reasonably easy Platinum Trophy to get. Usually I don't go for Platinum Trophies, as once I finish the main story of a game, I'll generally be done with it. But seeing I did lots of side quests as I played through the story, it didn't feel like there was an overwhelmingly large amount of stuff to do once I finished, so I actually felt motivated to do it all. There are a few random trophies you have to figure out where to go, as the game doesn't mark them on the map, but it's still pretty easy. So for you achievement hunters out there, this is definitely an easy one to get 100%. Even with all the little things the game adds to expand upon and differentiate itself from its predecessors, I couldn't help feeling the game kind of felt more the same. I feel it didn't feel as fresh as the first game, or even the smaller scale Miles Morales game. So I think at first it made me a little less excited about the game once I started playing. I feel part of the struggle is the game does take place in the same setting of New York City, which makes sense for Spider-Man, but the city does begin to feel less exciting coming back to it a third time with the same gameplay loop, even with the added areas. I also feel the side quests in general didn't spice things up enough to make the experience feel different. Upon reflection though, even though the game feels a bit of the same, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. Not every sequel needs to have a major overhaul of its systems, or have huge new additions to create a fun experience. Sometimes you can still have fresh ideas with what was there before. I still had a great time returning to play as the two Spider-Men, as the gameplay loop they've created is still fun, and the story was engaging again. In some cases, I feel little changes are okay, and a game doesn't have to evolve too much to breathe new life into it, and this sequel is definitely a showcase of that happening. If you're a Spider-Man fan, or enjoy story-focused action games with an open world, I definitely recommend this game for you, although you should play the previous two games first. If you've tried the previous games in this series though, and didn't like it before, admittedly I don't think this game has added anything that'll change your mind. I've personally enjoyed my time with Marvel Spider-Man 2 overall. I don't think it surpasses the first game, nor is it the top action game I played from 2023, but it's definitely a good game regardless. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they'll do next in this universe and all the potential DLCs, sequels, and spin-offs. This series Insomniac has been making is definitely fun, and they seem to have a good grasp of how to craft the experience and the spirit of playing as Spider-Man. Hope you've all had an amazing time watching the video. If you're interested in seeing more of my reviews or other videos, definitely punch that subscribe button. And I'll be seeing all of you spectacular people soon. Thanks for watching.
Almost there.